Baby did a bad, bad thing. Baby did a bad, bad thing.
Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt. I have been telling you all program long, I'm looking forward to the next couple of segments and to an extended conversation afterwards, because I'm going to talk now with Jack Carr, author of the brand new Red Sky Mourning. You probably know Jack as the creator of the Terminal List and James Reese. Jack Carr, good morning. Welcome to the Hugh Hewitt Show.
Good morning. How are you?
I am great.
Didn't realize that it's not 2:30 in the afternoon. I'm still on Paris time. I was just in Normandy, France for the D-Day 80th anniversary commemoration events and just got home a few hours back. So watch is still on time, France.
Thank you for coming up early. I got to tell you, I love Red Sky Mourning. And the backdrop for the rest of my audience, which is new. I've got new stations every month, Jack, and they're in the Key West, Florida, and all over the country. So I have to remind them, since I've been doing this for 24 years, I've talked to the late Vince Flynn was in studio with me, the late Jack Higgins, Danny Silva will be along on July 4, Brad Thor whenever he drops, CJ Box whenever he drops, Ken Follett spent 3 hours with me. I love thrillers. I was reluctant to actually get into Jack Carr because I don't have any bandwidth. And you know what happens is once a guy gets a hook into me, the hook is deep. But you are only the third thriller writer who has dared to deal with China. Brad Thor got into a little bit. Ken Follett got into it a little bit. You dove in deep. Why do you think our thriller writers are afraid to deal with China? Not afraid to.
That's a good question. I've never thought of it. I've not thought of it in those terms before. Maybe because it can be very confusing. And it takes a lot of time to do the research in order to have a foundation upon which to build then a fictional thriller. So maybe that's the case because there's a long history there. There's so many dynamics at play, both in China and in the United States, to say nothing of UK, Australia, the Pacific region generally. So there's a lot of moving parts, and perhaps that's the reason. Or maybe we thought about this till you just mentioned it, though. There's a lot of people who could possibly buy books or watch movies over there at some point. So I'm not sure if this ever makes it to film, if they would have to change it, but I hope not. I hope not after the success of Top Gun Maverick, where they put the Taiwan flag back on Tom Cruise's jacket for that one. So that goes to prove that perhaps it isn't as important of an audience as some may think. So I'm not sure, but when I dive into something, I go all in, all the way.
I don't think the CCP is going to let you translate Red Sky Mourning into Mandarin. I hope it shows up in Taiwan because it's really about Taiwan. And it's real. And we're not the difficulty of a thriller interview is not to give anything away while talking about the book. I'm very good at this, so we won't do that. No spoilers. I want to assure people, no spoilers. It's a James Reese thriller, so you know that. Number 7. And if you've watched Terminal List on Netflix, you know what that's all about, or Amazon Prime, I guess. But Jack, let me start with the fact I divide thrillers into 2 categories: things I did not know, and I'm glad I learned, and things I like to see in print in fiction because the fiction reading audience needs to learn it. Let's start with some of the things I did not know. I never heard of, am I pronouncing Seleucus Scouts correctly?
Seleucus Scouts.
I didn't know about them.
It doesn't sound exactly like.
All right, I did not know about them, and I'm curious why you became curious about them. They're the Rhodesian Special Forces from way back 65 to 72.
Yep. So I grew up, I'm a child of the 80s, which means that I was reading old Soldier of Fortune magazines from the 70s and during my formative years in the 80s. And there were oftentimes articles about Africa in there. It was a hot spot and a very interesting place. So at a young age where I probably couldn't comprehend exactly what was going on down there, I saw people running around with FNFALs, G3s, just all these weapon systems that to a young kid who intent on joining the military would find interesting and enthralling. So I found out about them first through Soldier of Fortune magazine. And there's also something called Gray's Scouts. If you go a little deeper, there's a lot of work on horseback. They mentioned something called pseudo-terrorist operations. I didn't know what that was back then, but my mom was a librarian, so I grew up surrounded by books and a love of reading, as you might be able to tell from my backdrop here. So I have stacks and stacks of books that I've collected over the years on warfare, on insurgencies, on counterinsurgencies, terrorism, special operations units, and I just started building building this foundation very early in life. So when it came time to write a thriller, I realized that no one that I knew of anyway, had really delved in or had a character with a background in the Selous Scouts. And one of my character's fathers spent time in that unit. And I can guess why. It's a kind of a hot topic, I would guess, if people went back and really studied it. But it's also extremely interesting and adds nuance to a very tense situation, I guess you would say, up until about 1979, 80, and then things change a little bit there, and may even get more interesting.
I wish the Selous Scouts had got Mugabe. Unfortunately, they let an evil man live and didn't get him. And whether or not Nkomo or Mugabe lived, they were trying to stop what happened. But it's fascinating rabbit hole I went down. Now, second thing I didn't know about. I know about anti-satellite weaponry, and I know about the threat we had. I've never heard of the Kessler effect. Are we really that vulnerable? We got 9,000 satellites. I did not know that. Private satellites. Are we really that vulnerable to the Kessler effect, or is the Kessler effect a hypothetical?
Well, it's still a theory because it hasn't happened yet. So I go into how you make it happen. If this is a theory and with all the different levels in the sky, you have the different orbits. You have mid-orbit, low orbit, high orbital satellites, and there's a lot of equipment up there flying around now. Some of them have this kind of AI technology where they're communicating in order to move so they don't hit each other. But I thought, what if you wanted them to hit each other in order to create a blanket of debris that would essentially hurt the United States more than would hurt the country causing that Kessler effect to happen. So that came out of the research as I started looking into what China had been doing with their space programs. And of course, that means their military space programs as well. So research intensive book this one was. The last few have been very research intensive. But the Kessler effect, I guess we won't know until it actually happens. But if you think about how much is up there, I would certainly say it's a possibility.
You know, Jack Carr, one of the reasons I love thrillers is they educate the public about stuff, a public that generally wouldn't be reading think tank reports or the Hudson Institute talking about the CCP and the PLA and the PLAN. But you put it into a thriller, especially the Chinese spy system, and Bolin and all the people around him, they are real, but I don't think Americans quite understand, and I'll get to something in a short bit. But they did it. I checked it out. I read the story on it after you write about the cyber attack on Guam in 2020. Well, I said, huh? My son-in-law was in Guam in 2020, still active duty Navy, and he didn't say anything to me about this, so I assumed it was classified. But I went in and I found an Axios report from May 24th of last year detailing that. When did you hear about it? And thank goodness it's in a book, because people need to know what the Chi-Coms are up to.
I found out about it when right around the time that it happened, just because I'm tuned into some of these things and I'm paying attention to these things. So I knew about it when it happened. And also I'm looking at that same time, I'm looking at how our enemy is going to take the lessons from COVID, from that time frame, and then apply them to their future battle plans. And I was actually writing a book called The Devil's Hand at the time, where that was the premise of the book before COVID. So I was thinking really what they were going to learn from us on the battlefields in Iraq and Afghanistan and how they were going to incorporate those lessons in. But then as I'm writing that, COVID hits, then a summer of, let's say, civil unrest, very contentious political season, an election cycle. So all of those things from the enemy's perspective are opportunities to learn and opportunities to figure out how to manipulate the American public in many cases. And how are they going to do that? So they look at it that way. When I talk about enemy, China is one, of course, Iran, Russia, North Korea, super empowered individuals, terrorist organizations. So I was looking at things through that lens, and I always have, because that's what I did in the SEAL teams. And as an author of these types of books, it's very helpful to do that as well. So I knew about it at the time. So we give up a lot of information and give our enemies a lot of opportunity to figure out how to manipulate us, both politically and militarily.
That's really scary. Guam is everything. We're going to come to more stuff, but I want to finish my list of things I did not know, because I'm baiting the hook for readers out there. Really? Another thriller writer? I said, yeah, really. Next one. I did not know. I knew about halo jumps. I didn't know about hey-ho jumps. So when Waltz was on this last hour, and I know he's a buddy of yours, I said, did you do a halo or a hey-ho in Normandy? And he said, we did a static line. And I didn't know what that is either. I don't know anything. I'm a civilian. Do you do that for the benefit of people like me to explain? I knew nothing about hey-hos, and I got a nephew in the teams, and he hasn't mentioned this to me.
Oh, funny. Yeah, most people know Halo. That's because they say it in movies. They say it in popular fiction from time to time. But really, yeah, static line is where you start, which is essentially the same technology as the guys jumped into Normandy, France with it back in 1944. And then, of course, Halo, which is what you think of when people skydive and they fall for a while, fly around, and then pull. And then hey-ho, high altitude, high opening, is when you jump up, out, and you pull, and then you can fly for a while. You can navigate using GPS, compass to get closer to an intended target, hopefully without being detected. So, and in the way I describe it in the book, I don't think that's ever been described like this. And I think maybe some people out there in the intelligence services and the military might scratch their head about how I figured that out, because I have not jumped out of the type of plane that I talk about or done it the way I talk about in the book. But I would think that there are a few people out there that maybe have.
I got to tell you, Jack, I'm not easily impressed by details like that. But that was fabulous. I had never, you have to describe that for civilians, what's going on and how difficult it is and how you got to take the oxygen with you and how you got to roll up in a ball and sky trash, all that good stuff. I mean, it's all in there. A couple more things I didn't know. Didn't know that Larry Ellison was CIA. Maybe everyone knows that but me. Did not know that Manila is the hub of the agency. Did not know that Indonesia has 18,000 islands. Did not know Ian Fleming had a golden typewriter. So, I mean, you've got like 25 things I've never heard of before. Is that an objective? Do you keep a scorecard when you're writing these things?
Maybe I should, but I like to weave things in because the books I like to read growing up, and I've been reading my entire life, reading David Morrell back in the 80s, J.C. Pollock, Mark Olden, all these masters of thrillers. And I love when they'd have a sentence in there that would make me go, they wrote this in a way that either I should know this as an American citizen, or they just want to, by context, I can figure it out so it doesn't take you out of the story. But it's just kind of a hint of something that was very intriguing. So I like to do the same thing, where if you don't know about something, I can describe it to a point, but other times I'll just put in a sentence here or there to make the reader go, oh, that's interesting. I understand by context what's happening here. But you know what? I'm going to go back and look into this later because this is fascinating. And I didn't know Larry Ellison was in the CIA either, and I've known him for quite a while now. And until he invited me to, he got an award from the CIA Officer Memorial Association, so we went out last November.
Jack Carr, author of this soon-to-drop bestseller, Red Sky Mourning. Go out and get it at Amazon so it arrives on day one. Jack, the second thing, and my entire conversation with Jack, including what we'll do off air after the show, will be on my podcast today. But Jack, the second part of things I look for, I make a list of things I'm glad to see in a thriller. I'm glad that you put a lot of emphasis on AI, a lot of emphasis on quantum computing. I was talking to Admiral Stav about you yesterday. He said you might be forward marching AI into our world. But then I go and I look at the list of the people who are out there, like Alex Carr of Palantir, Lucky Palmer of Anduril, Joe Lonsdale of Apeiros, Brett Granberg of Vannevar. They're a bunch of CEOs. They're not villains. I know a few of them like Peter Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg. But do you think there might be down the road a villain tech super mogul like this guy? And we're not going to tell them their name or anything about what they do.
Well, it's a tool, just like anything else, and tools can be used to build or destroy. So I think we have proven over the last, let's say 2 decades, that we're not very good at using these new technological innovations for the good. I mean, of course, you can argue there are amazing things like building businesses that you could never have built before because of these different platforms. We're doing this on a video call right now that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago, certainly. So there are good things. But if you looked at it holistically, I think the manipulation that these different platforms allow of the public is probably negates the good. But I might just be being cynical in my old age as well. But I would certainly say that it is a possibility in certain people's hands to use this tool to destroy.
You know, Joe Lonsdale was a guest a couple weeks ago. We're talking about his submersibles. And I was thinking to myself, he's a really good guy, but I hope we do vet him before he becomes a prime. And I bring that up in connection with a Josh Rogan piece. This is a book about China. Josh sat down with Admiral Paparo 2 days ago out in Singapore. And Admiral Paparo said his goal is, quote, I want to turn the Taiwan Strait into an unmanned hellscape using a number of classified capabilities. so that I can make their lives, China's lives, utterly miserable for a month, which buys me time for the rest of everything. Did you consult with the Admiral before you wrote Red Sky Mourning? Because that's basically the other side of this book.
Right. No, I think I did probably only through different articles, journals, books, interviews that I listened to on the China-Taiwan situation, that history, what you would do today. And one of the things in the book that when you're talking about capability China has, doesn't play into the story too much, but I bring it up, is a kind of as a technological counter they have to some of our submarines and our surface assets in and around Taiwan from the naval perspective. So the book doesn't focus on that, but there's a sentence or two about it in the novel. So it's a very interesting part of the world, and I was trying to put myself in the shoes of the Chinese, and they're looking at Taiwan like it's theirs. It has been theirs forever. And our policy even reinforces that with the One China policy. So there's a lot of dynamics at play here, and especially with the technological innovations that are coming that I talk about in the book, it does essentially put a timeline on when they would need to make that move. So who knows? We'll see what happens.
You know, I grew up on John le Carre before you were born. And what le Carre and Dayton and a bunch of these other people did is introduce me to how the Soviets thought about the KGB. What you're doing for this audience is there are China spy domains. They operate with at least as much lethal effectiveness as the old KGB did. And one of your Chinese spy masters says to Reese at one point, your open society has allowed us to place assets throughout your defense and intelligence community. Academia and the private sector are open for placement without any safeguards at all. It's on page 282 of Red Sky Mourning. Jack, do you think they are that thorough in penetrating every aspect of our society? And second part, what about the 40 to 60,000 Chinese nationals who've crossed our southern border in the last 4 years?
Oh, certainly. I mean, there's a vulnerability there, and it's going to be exploited. So you talk about the vulnerability on the southern border. Okay. Yep, absolutely. But we've had an open society for so long. And what does the enemy do? They look at that and figure out how can I exploit it? How can we exploit it? And now it's a multi-generational exploitation, essentially, which means that they could have been and have been placing assets throughout the United States for decades. So we are very vulnerable in that way. And you can just look at some of the articles that have come out, some of the actual facts. So if you think of those and think of, oh, this person's attached to this congressperson, they tried to buy up this land, they tried to buy this hotel near a military base.
Did they really try and buy the Hotel Del? Did they really?
They really did. They really did. Yeah, I have a blog coming out of my research here, doing the different books that I used in the research, and The Dragons and the Snakes by David Kilcullen, who also wrote Accidental Gorilla. He talks about the different hotels that the Chinese have tried to buy through different entities around the world that are near different bases, and the Hotel Del was one, and that was stopped, fortunately. But there are also, if you go just a few hundred yards down the beach, there are even taller buildings called the Shores that look right down onto Warcom. So that's the Naval Special Warfare Command right there. And I would be shocked if China didn't own a couple of those floors.
Jack, we don't have to rush now because I haven't got commercial breaks in the podcast, although I'll play some of this tomorrow morning. I want to go back to my list of things I did not know. I knew China's one-child policy had been a disaster. I did not know how much of a disaster and how it might 70% drop in their birth rate. Is that a fact?
When you're talking about China or Russia or Iran, North Korea, obviously, the data can be suspect. But I think that is the best data that we have indicates that's the number. But you never really know about things coming out of China. So I'd say that's the best guess, and I would be shocked if it wasn't close to being exact.
Now, one of the things you write about at length is how the approach of new technology, it isn't effective to deter until it's deployed. But if our enemies know we're about to deploy something like AI, like a quantum computing capacity, they will act in anticipation of that, which might speed up. And I do believe it's got every incentive for Xi and the CCP to speed up Taiwan, because they don't want Paparo to get his toys. They don't want Paparo to have submersibles. Do you think that's what's going on inside of Beijing right now?
I would say it's certainly a factor. It has to be. Once again, other countries might not, there might not be as much information about what sort of capabilities are in the works and timelines attached to those. But in the United States, we do have that. I'm sure there are black programs that we don't necessarily know when they're going to come out, but they can take some guesses on that based on open source intelligence and the assets that they have throughout not just the intelligence community, the military, but also all these companies that have contracts with the government. So and it doesn't have to be a Chinese asset. That can be a Chinese asset running somebody in one of those companies. So there are all sorts of factors at play here about how they can get information, both open source and through assets, and that they can just steal from computer systems through being able to exploit those types of networks. So they're very good at that sort of thing. So it's it's extremely interesting. And I would be shocked if they didn't have those assets at play and know exactly what we have coming down the line. And of course, that's going to factor into their planning process. So there are timelines attached to these things, certainly.
Jack, I want to go back now to my jolts and darts list. These are the things I like to see in a thriller so that the wider public that does not follow the small print finds out about them. And they should jolt them, or they should be a dart in their consciousness. At one point in the book, you have the Chinese spy guys talking to each other that it's a good thing that the United States is no longer a nation of readers. Now, I know your mom's a librarian, and I know you got that wonderful library behind you, and you and I are readers, obviously. But do you really think that's true? And especially when I have people like on Danny Silva and Brad Thor, they sell Chuck Box, #1 on the New York Times list, as like Red Sky Mourning will be. Who's reading your books? Are we really not a nation of readers anymore?
Well, if you wrote in the 80s, 90s, early 2000s, there were certainly more readers. And you can just look at book sales in general from those people who wrote back in the 80s, 90s, and look at those numbers today. They still sell a lot of books, but not relative to how much they sold back in the 80s and 90s. So it certainly did help to build up a readership back then. He was now older and living in retirement homes in Florida who buy those hardbacks day one. But as a nation, generally, we are reading less and less, unfortunately. There are obviously many more distractions than there were in the 80s or 90s to people who were reading back then, because you could either play Atari 2600 for only so long in the 80s, watch a movie, maybe one a weekend if something was coming out that had a certain time that it started, so you had to be there at a certain time, a TV show that you couldn't just get on demand. You obviously had to wait until 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock for that show to come out. You could sit down and then watch for an hour, or you could read. So now, of course, every single platform, from YouTube to TikTok to Instagram to Facebook, all these different podcasts, all the different streaming services. There are so many more entities that you are competing with as an author for people's attention. So I'm very fortunate that this character in these books struck a chord with people. So I'm trying to convert more people into readers. And I think the audiobook, because people that listen to your show, listen to your podcast, I think it's a very natural thing to do these days for them to become audiobook listeners. So I hope that's kind of the gateway drug to actual reading for people. And
that's interesting, Jack. My summer treat for myself, because I work a lot and I got to read a lot for work. And sometimes when someone like Simon & Schuster comes along and says, "Hey, read Jack Carr," and I read it and I say, "Wow, I'm going to have to read every one." I'll listen to the future one. I'm re-listening to Patrick O'Brien's 21 Aubrey Maturin novels, and I just finished #3 last night, the HMS Surprise. Did you ever read Patrick O'Brien, by the way?
I did a long time ago. I think in high school. My step-grandfather, my real grandfather, was killed in World War II off Okinawa in 1945. My step-grandfather gave me that back. I want to say back in the late 80s. Is that possible? So I read it in high school, I would say.
Yeah, well, that was available in then, and it actually started in the 70s. Yeah. But the audiobooks are fabulous because the narrator is extraordinarily talented. Who's your narrator for the audio version of Red Sky Mourning?
Ray Porter. I got extremely fortunate in that I got to choose him, meaning Simon & Schuster for my first book. Of course, I hadn't made one sale yet, and they recommend someone, and I listened to the recommendation. I didn't even know who it was, and I thought, that doesn't sound quite right. And I asked if I could choose somebody, and they said, well, yeah, just let us know who you'd like, and we can ask them. And so I just started listening, because I'm a reader. I'm a physical reader. I hadn't really listened to audiobooks before. And so I started listening to all those samples, and I found this guy, Ray Porter, and I had no idea at the time that he is at the pinnacle of audiobook narration. And I didn't realize that he also brings an audience with him to the audio. People go follow a narrator around now to their different projects, which was fascinating to me, something I didn't know before. So I have Ray Porter, incredible guy. We're dear friends now, and he's narrated all of the novels thus far.
I've got to mention at this point, because I listen to books when I'm trundling. I no longer run. I used to be a pretty good runner. I used to be pretty fast, but I'm an old man now. But I'm no longer going to say that because of your one bit of wisdom in this book. Don't let the old man in. I joke about it, but don't let the old man in. Where did you get that from?
That's from a friend, Mike Stoner, who's a photographer here in Park City, where we live. He took my author photo here. We've been friends for years, but he's the most interesting man in the world. He did some photography in Iran back in the day. He takes motorcycle rides all over the country. Amazing guy. But he told me that. He said, don't let the old man in. And I said, I'm going to write that down right now and put this in my next novel. And someone had passed that along to him as well. So it worked out perfectly for the chapter you're referencing.
Man, that should be, I don't want to talk about that character, but I do want people to read it to get that as well. Let's go back. Here's what may be the most important. Actually, it's going to be the trigger for some people. You write glowingly about the CIA, but on page 249, CIA doing serious stuff. The FBI, quote, are too busy surveilling school board meetings. And that California, quote, it might become a one-party nation if what happened to California happens to the rest of the country, and that all the producers are leaving California. I mean, I gather you've got some politics in your life.
I mean, they are political thrillers. So it is of course, you have to weave that sort of thing in. That's fun for me. And hey, the FBI, they're bringing it on themselves these days with some of those actions. So of course, you got to throw those in from time to time. And that eventually one day, just like the Fleming novels here are essentially time capsules of a post-World War II Great Britain through the eyes of James Bond, of course, protagonist, and Ian Fleming, the author. So people might look back on these one day as a time capsule to this time and say, wait, what was this about the FBI and what were they doing at that time? Was that even legal? How did this happen? So I don't try to write something that's bland that's going to appeal to everyone. I go all in, and people have opinions, just like my characters have opinions. Some they voice, some they don't. Some are part of that internal monologue. But I get to explore different sides of issues through the eyes of different characters. So I never try to make it bland. I never worry about alienating a readership or anything like that. For me, it's all about the story. That's what I owe my readership, who's trusting me with time that they're never going to get back. So for me, it is all about that story.
Now, I got to tell you, there's a character in this book, a congressperson, whose spouse is making a lot of money. And I know exactly the two people on whom that is based. And I think it's a problem. It's a big problem. I happen to know Republicans who day traded. They're not in Congress anymore. And I couldn't believe it. They were in financial services. I'm glad you put that in there because this is actually a problem. Had you read about the same two people I'm thinking about? Because they're on the left side of the world as opposed to the right side of the world. But you probably don't know about the Republican who did this too. It's a bipartisan corruption.
It is definitely bipartisan corruption, and I talk about that in the book, Congress in general, how much they beat the market every year. And then there's the outliers that not only beat the market every year, but crush it every year. But as a whole, all of them essentially do a little bit better than the rest of us. So that's fascinating, and that is definitely across the board issue. That is not just one side or the other.
Okay, let's talk now about Overmatch. John Poindexter, during the early days of the War on Terror, attempted to persuade the Pentagon to stand up, basically surveillance of the internet of all things. And it got shot down because Americans are very, very sketchy, very, very touchy about their privacy. Overmatch is the internet of all things linked up with AI. Do you think we would ever fully automate our defense systems so that PACOM actually anticipates and responds before human intervenes with the decision making?
I think that's the direction we're heading, and that you're going to have to, because if you look at the enemy and what they're doing, what really you're doing both on the battlefield, the tactical level, and then at the strategic level with decision making, is having to make decisions faster than the enemy. So you're having to adapt quicker than your enemy, getting inside that decision-making cycle. So if the enemy has something similar to autonomous control of their military and they launch, that means that you're going to have to do the same thing. Otherwise, you're going to have to get the generals out of bed, get the Joint Chiefs out of bed, get the president out of bed. They're going to have to talk about what's happening. And by that point, you have missiles raining down on the West Coast and even the East Coast. So I think eventually you're going to have to move that way. And we're inching that way right now. So if we think about how fast technology has progressed over the last couple decades, and it's just getting faster and faster and faster, well, I bet in the coming years, that's where we're going. We're certainly headed that direction.
There's a new series out called The Three-Body Problem, and it reminds me, as your book does, about the late Charles Krauthammer's column, probably the most profound column I've ever read. He talks about, is there artificial life, is there intelligent life in the universe, and why haven't we been contacted by him? And Charles put forward the theory, that's because all advanced civilizations destroy themselves before they reach out to another civilization. And what you've got here is a very believable sort of the matrix, a fully autonomous world that is controlling the humans within it. Does that worry you?
Oh, certainly. Certainly it does. It can stifle creativity. It can have all sorts of ill effects on the next generation who is more in tune with this technology. It's more natural for them to accept these sorts of things, these sorts of manipulations, these sort of comforts, these sort of conveniences. Whereas us, we might be a little more skeptical about them. But we're also getting older, and that onslaught of technological innovation isn't slowing down anytime soon, and it's about to crash on a generation that accepts and even craves even more comfort and convenience. So it's interesting. I think I'm going to stay up here in the mountains of Utah on the high ground.
Yeah, that's the mountains of Utah. A lot of my friends have moved up to the mountains of Utah for a reason. Let me talk about the laugh out loud line. It's on page 406. You're going to have to read the whole book to get to it. And you're going to have to read the whole book to understand why it's funny. I have much to absorb when reading a room. I think that's very funny, Jack. Do you think people will understand what that is? Because it's one line in a National Security Council meeting, and it's hilarious.
There are a few things thrown in there. I like to move things along with humor. In the foxhole, humor is important. I would assume every now and again in a boardroom, it's important. Otherwise, everyone's just going to be miserable. So it doesn't have to be stand-up comedy type funny, but we're human, and that humor can go a long way. So there's a few of those little I don't know, sentences, quotes, zingers even in there that I like to weave in.
All right, the two more subjects, Jack Carr. Red Sky Mourning has got the most painful interrogation scene I've ever read. And Vince Flynn was in my studio talking about one of his Mitch Rapp novels on the night he got his diagnosis, and we greatly miss Vince. But he was not shy about the necessity of making interrogation painful. That is not the United States way of doing things. But honest to God, where did you come up with that?
Well, I started it in the first book, and it's kind of become a thing now that people look forward to in these novels. So each one has a different interrogation scene, and from the outset, I wanted to make sure they were never just something that was, let's say, a bigger explosion type. I didn't come at it from that perspective, like shoot him in the other leg, shoot him in the other knee type of thing, something that you hadn't read before. So I go deep down the rabbit hole in each of the books into a different way of interrogate someone who is let's say, vacated the high ground when it comes to the moral high ground, and has these skills and abilities and uses them on the enemy. So each book has one. And actually in the show, Amazon was a little nervous about one of them for the series with Chris Pratt, and had to have a couple conversations about keeping that in. So it's in there, and it's a gutting scene from the first one. And then of course it ends up being on every billboard in LA when the show came out. So it did work out. But this one, I wanted to also bring in, it had to make sense for the story. So in each of the books, sometimes it's something that was done in the gulags maybe, or something that China had done, but something that was done in Africa, something that was done in Central South America. So all of these things have history behind them and also move the story forward. So for me, I wanted to be thoughtful about this sort of violence rather than just you shoot them in the other knee or something that we've seen a million times before. So
yeah, that was groundbreaking when Vince did it 20 years ago. It's not really going to make people go, huh? I'm going to add a bonus question before I go to my last one. Terminal List 2, second season coming out. It's always a good sign when a second season is made. How well did Terminal List 1 do, and what do they expect out of Terminal List Season 2?
Well, they never share the exact data with us. They'll keep that all close hold. They won't even share it with Chris Pratt or Antoine Fuqua, the director. They'll never share that. But we know that it did very well because of some inside sources, and also because they ordered 2 more shows. So before I was in Normandy for the D-Day 80th anniversary commemoration events, I was in Budapest filming the first spin-off that focuses on one of the bad guys in the first story, and shows how he goes from the SEAL teams to the CIA and how he makes this transition to the dark side. So it's more of starts out action and moves into more of an espionage thriller, which is so fun to write. And then True Believer, my second novel, we start filming that I think at some point in early 2025. So there's a lot to look forward to, but it did well, if even just by the indication that Amazon ordered more of them.
My very last question, it's the crossover category, things I did not know, plus things I'm glad that it's in the book. And it's about, I hope I pronounced the name correctly, the biologist Jean Rostand, who wrote Thoughts from a Biologist. The line is, kill one man and you are a murderer, kill millions of men and you are a conqueror, kill them all and you are a god. All right, I didn't know that. I didn't know that Jean Rostand said that. How in the world did you ever find an obscure biologist, Thoughts from a Biologist? How did that come to your attention?
Well, for this, I knew the quote. I knew that quote. I'd heard it many times in the past. I'd seen it referenced in the past. And then when I get to a novel where I want to incorporate one of these things that I'm familiar with from the past, then I check. I said, well, where did this actually come from? And I started going down the rabbit hole on where this actually came from. Of course, now it's a little more difficult because there's so much information out there online that's not correct. So you really have to check. You can't just do a cursory search on something anymore. You really have to investigate. So I went down the rabbit hole on this guy and found out that he was the one who wrote that back when he did. So I wanted to weave that into the story, and this was a good place to put it.
Now, I hope to give you something that you may not know. You have both a lot of C.S. Lewis in this book and an interesting conversation about Ayn Rand. Did you know that the latter loathed the former, and that in her notes on Mere Christianity, she has scathing comments about C.S. Lewis? Did you know that?
I didn't know that exactly, that she had those comments actually written down somewhere, so I haven't read those from her, but I certainly know that she has scathing comments about Christianity as a whole, religion as a whole, of course. So it is interesting to think about that and put them both into a story like this. So people who read The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, of course, especially if they are religious, there's still something in there for them. But a lot of times they get fixated on that part of Ayn Rand, that she did have these scathing thoughts, comments, ideas about Christianity and religion in general, and they get caught up on that a lot of the time and don't really take the good out of those novels in particular. So, and her other work as well. But
I
you kind of have to separate.
I've never read The Fountainhead. I was interested at your observation that if you read them both, you'll be more influenced by the first one you read. And I think you're right. Tim Sandifer, a law student of mine, has written a book about the Furies, the 3 great libertarian female novelists of the last 100 years. And I just found that the juxtaposition that you borrow from C.S. Lewis and from Ayn Rand is interesting to me, and it's really unexpected in a thriller. Jack Carr, congratulations. You hooked me. I'm sure you hook more people every year. That opening scene really hooked me. Red Sky Mourning America. Go out and get it. Order it from Amazon now. And listen to the rest of this podcast.